Have you ever been on a trip? A road trip, an international trip, a bus trip, a flight somewhere new, or maybe a short trip around your neighborhood on your bike or on a skateboard. No matter what type of trip you've been on, it's usually pretty important to know where you're headed or to have some sort of plan as you go.
Can you imagine traveling out into the world without knowing what's in front of you? No map, no directions, no steps to follow. It's just you and the unknown. It's uncharted territory, somewhere that you've never been before. I mean, take a look at these locations. I don't know about you, but while these places are amazing and beautiful, thinking about traveling to them without a plan or directions stresses me out. It's pretty intimidating and even a little scary, thinking about traveling into the unknown.
Walking into uncharted territory can be pretty tough. Maybe you know what it feels like to be the new kid at school. Walking in those doors the first day probably made you want to throw up a little bit. Or maybe you've moved around a lot, so you know what it feels like to start over in a new city. Finding new friends, learning the lay of the land in your new neighborhood, trying to keep up with what's cool in your new town, it's enough to overwhelm anybody.
The reality is that whenever we walk into uncharted territory, there's a part of us that's afraid. We're nervous because it's new, it's unfamiliar. Despite how difficult it can sometimes be to take a step into the unknown, we all have to answer this question in our own lives. Am I willing to go into uncharted territory when God calls me to?
Now, if the idea of God calling you to do something sounds weird, just stick with me for one moment. Whether you've been around church since you were a baby or you are brand new to this whole faith thing, you've probably heard people say that God has spoken to them, or is leading them somewhere, or is calling them to something. But all of that makes no sense to you because A, it's weird, and B, you haven't heard so much as a whisper from God in your own life.
When people say God's calling them to do something, they don't typically mean that they heard God's actual voice telling them what to do or where to go. It's usually more of an instinct, something they feel in their hearts. And as they pray and ask God for His guidance, He continues to nudge their hearts in that direction. But it's up to them to follow or not.
Now, some of you are probably thinking, I hope God doesn't call me. I get it. I mean, if God calls us to something unknown, to that uncharted territory, it can be kind of scary. And what if He calls us to do something that's difficult? What if we have to walk away from someone or something that we really love? Or what if God asks us to do something insanely boring?
Others of you who are perfectionists may worry that you will fail at whatever God's going to call you to do. I mean, if there's one thing you want to do perfectly, it's to follow God. So what if He calls you to do something and you think you aren't qualified? What if you make the wrong choice along the way? How awful would that feel?
Or maybe there are some of you who have already felt called to something in your own life, and you took a step to follow God. Maybe it was at the end of camp, or during a mission trip, in a conversation with a friend, or in the quiet of your room. You felt God calling you, and you took a step in His direction.
Regardless of whether you've heard from God or not, I think the idea of being called by God is kind of awesome. It actually means something really cool and exciting is going on. So what does it look like when God calls us? And how can we find the courage to respond to His leading, even when it's into the unknown and uncharted places in our lives?
Thankfully, the Bible gives us a lot of examples of people who heard God's call and responded to it. So let's look at one of the first to do it, Abraham. For the Christian faith, Abraham is considered a pioneer, someone who goes into uncharted territories and paves the way for others to follow.
There are a bunch of pioneers that you've probably already heard of. Martin Luther King Jr. was a preacher who led the way for civil rights in America. Amelia Earhart was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic on an airplane. Steve Jobs founded Apple. Susan B. Anthony laid the groundwork for the women's right to vote. All of these people were pioneers, paving the way for the rest of us to follow.
And Abraham is at the top of that list. When we meet Abraham in the Bible, he's pretty comfortable living with his wife Sarah and his extended family in a town called Haran. So let's read what God has to say to Abraham to get him out of his comfort zone and into uncharted territory. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
So let's get this straight, because there were a whole lot of things God offered to Abraham. God promised Abraham, a 75-year-old married guy with no kids, that he would make him into a great nation. In other words, God would give Abraham a family tree full of children for generations to come. Can we say #Father Abraham? At his age, with his background, Abraham didn't seem to be the logical choice for this job.
God also promised to bless Abraham and make his name great over all the earth. Basically, Abraham would become the most well-known guy in the world if he followed God's call. And even beyond that, God promised to bless Abraham so much that he could then bless other people. God was on Abraham's side so much that even Abraham's enemies would become God's enemies. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal, right?
Well, and all Abraham had to do was agree to leave his home, everything and everyone he'd ever known for 75 years, to go into a land that God would show him. In other words, Abraham had to step into uncharted territory to follow a God he barely even knew.
Now, I don't know about you, but if that happened to be me, I'd probably be like, no thanks, God. Those things sound good and all, but I think I'll stay here. My friends are here, my family's here, and I barely know you anyways. I'm good where I'm at.
But not Abraham. He actually followed God's command and went into uncharted territory. In that moment, the man who would one day become the pioneer of our faith started his journey with one step. He didn't know how it was going to turn out or what hung in the balance of his decision. He didn't even really know where he was going, but he still took a step. And sometimes that's what faith is all about, taking a small step even when we don't fully know where or what God is calling us to. Why? Because small steps lead to big places. Like this ladder I'm standing on, our lives are full of so many single steps that eventually lead to big destinations.
I mean, just look at Abraham's story. All he did was follow God's calling and take a step. Eventually, Abraham and Sarah had children, resulting in an entire nation. And Abraham actually became the father of our faith, just like God promised. But his step didn't immediately lead to great things. In fact, it was met with dead silence for a long time. It was full of lots of ups and downs, and he messed up a lot, a whole lot. We'll unpack more of that in the coming weeks, but the point is this: Abraham took the step. He chose courage over fear, and he stepped out into the unknown. And those small steps led to some pretty big places.
And that's what I want you to take away from all of this. Small steps lead to big places. I know sometimes it seems easier to just stay where you are, but when you do, you risk missing out on the big, exciting things God has for your life. Imagine what taking just one small step might look like for you this week.
Maybe for some of you, you haven't sensed God call you, so your step is to simply tell God you're listening and waiting for Him. And then listen, pray for God to show you the next step. Or maybe for you, you aren't really all that interested in hearing from God about where He's leading you. And that's okay. We're all at different places in our faith. Maybe your first step is just to be open to listening and thinking about what God might be nudging you toward.
And for others, maybe you already know the next step that you need to take. Maybe God's urging you to forgive your siblings for something, or to end an unhealthy relationship, or maybe take a break from social media, or sign up for that mission trip to that place that you've never been. You don't know how it's going to turn out, but you do know the next step that you need to take to get there.
Ask for God's courage in taking that step. Talk to your small group leader and ask for their help as you do. And trust that, just like in Abraham's story, God is working in and around you as you journey through life, one step at a time. Choose to put fear aside and trust Him, even when He's calling you into uncharted territory. Because you never know what lies ahead. You never know what big places your small steps will lead you to. As you leave, think about this question. What's one thing holding you back from taking the next step God has for you?